Hello, everyone, and as I promised, we are back. It seems like with the last one, because the last keynote is coming, and we have some more sessions. But let's see. I won't say much. I have here right now with me Kim Caliatro.
Filiatro.
Caliatro. Trying to pronounce French last name. We were discussing because I always butcher the last names. And you were here at the conference doing a presentation and
I
a
did.
tutorial, if I see it.
Nope, just a
Just a
presentation this morning.
presentation.
Yes.
And first of all, I like always to give an introduction. Can you share with the people watching what's the deal with Kim? What do you do, and um, what's your gig, to put it in a
Certainly.
way?
I'm actually the founder, CEO of my company. It started as a consultancy. It actually was a private consultant. I've been an independent consultant for most of my career, 38 years, and I've been independent for 36 of that. So challenging. I've gone through old mainframes right through client server to then back to the cloud, and now to everything being driven off down to the mobile devices. So I've been through all of the different iterations of technologies. Very exciting times. To now, I actually have a team that works for me in my company, based around the world. They're in Poland, Latvia, a number of them here in the U.S. So exciting times, and it started around consultancies, and now we actually have technologies that we have developed around the insurance industry primarily. So automated testing through data extraction, and my talk this morning was on data extraction, pulling data from production down into your test environments.
Okay, that's what is the process that you utilize? Because most the first what most think is like, let's log in and start like copying and downloading. What processes do you use for data extraction?
So we actually started, we didn't even think about data extraction as a starting point. We were actually wanting to anonymize production data because there were companies that we had spoken with that would literally take their production databases and ship it off site to organizations to use it for testing against. And their consideration is they're secure, they're private, because the places it's going to have secure areas where you can't go in with electronic devices, nobody's allowed to take any paper in or out, and therefore their data is secure. But people can remember things. So I thought there's not a lot of security in this consideration. So why don't you anonymize it instead? And the process was very difficult for them to anonymize everything they needed to. And so we started our first iteration from that perspective. And I've been doing anonymization for a better part of 2 decades now, but never across an entire database system. And so we just went in to anonymize the insurance system that we were working with at the time, of everything that was relevant. And it wasn't just PII and PFI that people care about, but anything that could potentially impact information from a privacy perspective. And so we just had to really figure that out. And the domain is very complex, multiple systems, not just one environment with one database and multiple tables, but multiple databases across multiple systems that all have to carry the information. So it was quite challenging. And that was anonymization. That's where we started.
There's an interesting point where we were having a conversation earlier about these test data and the preparations when you anonymize it. There's a middle ground, right? Because sometimes you can anonymize it so much that it's not good for testing or gets.
Right.
We got a very good example earlier about in Mexico we have two first and middle name, two last names, and
Yes.
people like my unlucky sister that has three names in front, and probably the field won't fit, and that's a very good test. And if you anonymize that, do you count into some of those patterns for anonymization?
Yes. So we, as part of our anonymization process, we created very generic algorithms. So you would tie a field into an algorithm that would be used for the anonymization process. And then we go to a dictionary of valid terms and conditions that you want as part of the process. So names is a great example where we actually created 2 columns of names. For a first name would have 2 columns, last name would have 2 columns of names. And these would be all distinct names, so you can actually pair them together for multi-part names. The two names make up the first names, or 3 names make up the first name if you want, and you can decide how that process works. And then as part of anonymization, we always have to know the size of the field so that when we do the anonymization process, we do not exceed bounds. So as part of anonymizing data to make a test usable, we have to stay within the constraints of the data. And we don't want to produce test data that will cause failures. We want to make sure you anonymize to within the constraints of the system that you go to. And so we have to have enough information what we extract from or what we're anonymizing to in regards to the size of the field, some slight piece of information such as the first letter of the name or the second letter of the name, because we also wanted to ensure that what we do, we never get to see the originating data, because then that puts us at risk, much like the vendors or the client is at risk. If they expose their data, they're liable. If we see their data, that makes us as liable as they are. So we never want to see any of the source data.
It's interesting, like even you just got me thinking with passwords.
Oh yeah.
I will store your password. No, I don't want to know your password.
Don't
It's
want to
going
know
to be
your
something in
password.
between that neither I nor one.
Yep.
And the organizations that store them, in theory, do not know them. In theory, we have known of stories, but this is really interesting around. And it's the second time today that we talk about test data and this anonymization. I got it right the first one, where it's a big topic. Do you work with European?
We do. GDPR compliance is what you're going to. And that was actually one of the main reasons we did it as well. Not only did we want to anonymize test data, but we saw an opportunity for GDPR in Europe and also for CCPA in California, and other states are picking up privacy and consumer laws.
Yeah.
And we have actually developed our technology to account for two primary considerations of GDPR, and that's the what we call the tell me and the forget me rules. So you have a person wants to call in and say, what do you know about me? We can actually now go navigate your entire data structure and pull that information out, because we had to figure out all of the information that was relevant to anonymize. That's basically the information people want to know about themselves as well. How are you using my data? So we had to figure out the data structure to be able to get to the information. What's interesting is on the forget me side, which is more relevant, when a consumer phones in and says, hey, I want you to forget everything about me. There are two ways you can actually support that. One is to delete the data. And if you delete the data, you have to know the structure to go into that data. So to anonymize it, we also have to understand the structure to be able to know what we can delete. But more commonly is the requirement to just anonymize the data in place. So if you're in a production system, by law, even though you have to air quote delete it, you don't actually have to remove it, because your structure may not even allow it. You might just break too many things. So you don't have to by law delete it, but you have to anonymize or obfuscate it, effectively anonymize it.
You are missing a key value on the table, and then
everything dies.
You do, yeah.
So if we have the ability to anonymize data when we want to extract it and give it off to somebody else, that means we can target just that policy or that account for that consumer and anonymize everything in that structure for them. So it actually gave us the ability to support GDPR and CCPA and other ones within the US as well.
That's very interesting. Sounds like, if I'm understanding well, you just kind of overwrite that data without deleting the record and making it like, when you wipe a hard drive, truly wipe it, you rewrite it a few times so that it's...
And we don't do that. We anonymize it so that you don't know that the consumer was Peter Smith. It's now a John Doe. But within context, if you change their policy and the claim system is at a different database, a different system, you still have to change their name on the claims, or their names on their account, or their names into another external system altogether. And so you have to know those relationships to be able to do all of that as well.
And all of this, you do it for... You mentioned that you enable testing for testing purposes.
Yes.
Something that is interesting for me as well, because I mentioned earlier, in performance and load testing, we need test data.
Yes.
We need lots of test data.
And you need good test data.
That as well. Because if you don't trigger the process, the system may receive your data, but if it's not starting a good process, a policy doesn't exist on the other side. Several things that the depth can get interesting. How do you do, or do you work with volumes like
Absolutely.
Big?
So the easy thing to do, and why we started with anonymization, is it's easy to anonymize an entire database system, because you have everything is within context. You don't have to worry about breaking your chains and that sort of stuff. So it's easy to anonymize an entire production system. But if you want to do a lot of different stress testing, as an example, and you know that you have a policy in production that's been around for 10 years, gone through multiple iterations and changes, you can't recreate that because of the size of it or the complexity of the changes. It can be very hard to recreate. But when you want to test that in a stress situation, you can actually pull down that single policy then, put it into a test environment, your stress environment, and then replicate that same policy structure maybe 50 or 100 times, and now start banging at this all at the same time using maybe 5 different policies that have very complex structures that you've replicated 5 times. That gives you 25 distinct policies to be able to log in and do some type of change to on the fly. And being able to pull down a targeted policy or account or a claim, put that into another system and replicate that 20, 50, 100 times just to create an environment that you can test against is another process that we actually, one of the reasons we went into doing the whole extraction and loading process.
Kind of tricks, because that's a big task when I have found organizations. Let's move everything, and then it's not the right approach.
It's not the right approach. It's an approach. It might not be the best approach.
It's tough. It's really tough.
Yeah.
And once you move this data, something, and I'm from very egotistical situations where I have been in. Can I connect to that new data and have it for my testing that I need to pull it at volumes, or do you work?
Yep. No. So our whole process, we go through, we call it a container process. When we extract it, you don't connect to an environment, pull that data down into your local environment. What we do is we connect to an environment that is your source, and we pull that into a container and put it in JSON. And now you connect to those containers and you can pull them into any environment. So you can now pull from production, which will always be anonymized. You can't pull from production without anonymizing it. Put it into a container. Now anybody can get to a container, to that container. Anybody you allow to can get to that container to allow you to load that policy into their local environment or into a QA environment to recreate a production problem, for example. You can even go the other way around. You can take from your local environment, maybe you've created a very complex test policy that you want to be able to recreate. And you don't want to just back up the database, try a change, break it, drop it, load the database and change it again. You can simply extract that policy or that account into a container and then pull that in, replicate it 50 times, and then try something didn't work, try something didn't work, try something didn't work without having to reload the database. Or take a container and give it to a fellow colleague and have them load your policy up and try something on their machine.
That's great because it gives you data refreshes and
Absolutely.
big time in performance. I burned this record, I cannot use it anymore. And you
Yeah.
roll back and you did, and that's
You don't want to be doing that. Very time consuming.
if
and
it's
what's-
easy and straightforward, I love
Sure.
that solution.
Yeah. And even think about it from an automated test perspective. If you have a very complex policy and you're trying to recreate a specific condition that you don't regress a problem down the chain, do you want to have a policy that maybe takes you 30 seconds or a minute to get to a point in state where you create that policy and load it up, maybe go through a UI process to create it so that you confirm all the other steps? Or can you get that policy to a point in place where you want to now extract that? You can actually then load that policy up as part of a test process and simply say, I want to load the policy up that takes me to the right state. And then I want to run the test from that point forward and bypass all of these steps to do your 3 or 5 or 6 steps to make sure that this flow works from that endpoint. And you don't have to go through the whole process. So you might have a test, long running test that takes 2 minutes in the UI that goes through 500 different steps. And what you really want to verify is the last 50. You can create that step to step 450, stop the process. Now extract that policy intact as it is, create that as a container element, load that as part of the first step of your test, and then continue from step 451 to 500, which tests the last piece of the puzzle. So it actually optimizes the automated test process as well.
I think that enables a lot of agile testing because you should be avoiding long end-to-end steps on our testing steps. And a big problem is when you have data that has a state. I was doing an example earlier of, let's say I have to check in a bag. That's the process for checking in a bag on an airplane.
Yeah.
That I cannot if I have not checked in for the plane. And if you can leave my data just in that status that I can just straight go ahead into that testing, that is awesome because my sprint won't be stopping and waiting for the data to get into that state.
Absolutely.
It's very interesting, and I think a lot of organizations will benefit out of that. Was your talk related about that?
It was all about the anonymization, extraction, and then loading of the data and how you can actually. The talk was not about what you can do and how you and why you want to do it. The talk was about what are the problems that we hit when we're trying to actually implement the process. So the talk was not about this is why you want to do it. We explained why you want to do it. It saves a lot of time and effort, in the overall process.
Some of those problems.
We exposed some of the problems. We didn't necessarily show you our solutions because of IP, But what we did is explain the problems that we hit, why we ended up coming to those problems, and then this is what you want to think about and implement it with a solution of your own. But this is the approach we took, was the approach, not necessarily the implementation.
And to give back something to the audience, to
Yes.
for people watching, that they can learn and understand better. Any recommendation regarding data, regarding all of these situations? Because we all have been bitten by test data requirements or needs. What would you tell the world? What should they be looking for?
So we had a very specific need in this case to ensure that we could reduce the risk associated with trying to get live data in different ways. So make sure that the data is valid, and there's no better source of truth in production to make sure that your data is valid. Make sure you have complex scenarios that you want it to work with, because we can always recreate policies. We can drive through a UI process, maybe have a back-end builders that will create data for us on the fly. You can always do that, but there's nothing, again, more complex than what production is going to be. You're not going to recreate something as complex as what production ends up being at the end of the day. And so that was our primary need. And then from that basis, we really thought about, we know enough information, why don't we look at GDPR? And then from GDPR, we needed to be able to anonymize true data on the fly in a targeted fashion. And once we did that, then it's like, if we can target this to anonymize it, then we can do this other process. So it really was an evolution. And if you understand how your data structure works, you should be able to do that same thing yourself. Now, there's effort involved. Don't take it lightly. It'll be challenging. But if you're able to go through the process, at the end of the day, you're going to have a much more solid automated test capabilities, because you can do real world processing. And that's what really came to us out of the process, is it's real world validations and executions and recreations to fix production problems. I mean, most of the time, and hopefully it's most of the time, when you have a production failure, you can track through the logs, find out what happened, recreate the problem, and then you recreate it, you're good to go, you fix it. But on those times that you can't recreate that problem because you don't know exactly what happened, how it did it, and the logs don't give you advice, and you look at the problem internally without being able to get the live data. And so historically, we've always just given somebody access to a copy of production. You can't do that on locals, so you have to have it in an environment somewhere. You have to create a copy of a production environment somewhere. And so it was just trying to optimize the whole QA process. Well, we took advantage of other things like GDPR options and opportunities for our company, but it was really to help optimize the QA process.
That's you touched on several points. Try to get data as real as possible. Many of our tests often fail because we have Darth Vader and Donald Ducks in our names of users or people, and some of them, I'm coming with the silliest examples I can think of, but there are several like that we may not be doing the best tests because we have the best data. I love that recommendation. And whenever you can, grab that in volume, performance, have enough volume so that you may mimic as well a realistic test. But in terms of functionality as well, it's very interesting, very important. Pay attention to these recommendations. Kim, where can people find out more about you?
So, Kim Filiatro, my company is kimputing.com. Kim being like Kimberly, but just short. So, KIMPUTING.com. Our website has a lot of information on it. Reach out to me at any time. I'm available basically 24/7. I have a team in Europe, and I don't sleep very often, and I just love what I do. So I'm available pretty well anytime. If you do reach out, I might not get you right away because I might be in a meeting or on a call, but you'll hear back from me fairly quickly. It'd be interesting to hear from y'all.
Get in touch if you have any data needs or questions or how to work better with your data. Kim, thank you so much for coming and sharing a little bit. Has been a pleasure. And everyone, I think I'm seeing things getting wrapped up. The last keynote is coming. I don't know what is going to happen. I have done this before. This may be the last stream. I'm not sure. Let's see what happens. But if this is the last stream, everyone, thank you very much for following up, coming to this, watching these interviews and this fun that we have been having in Agile Testing Days in Chicago. So, adios, I think, and I'll see you around soon, because next week, QA or the highway. Stay tuned.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. Adios, everyone.
Bye.
Let's stop this thing, and I